If we think it through, we can fairly easily understand that the presence of human beings has an effect on the world around us. I mean, literally, these buildings are here because of us, because of people. Um, Wherever we are, we affect change on the world. It can, however, be hard for us to understand how much of an effect we have because we're the ones doing it, right? It's hard to step outside of ourselves, see what we're doing, and see what effect it has on the world because it feels like each of us is doing a little bit, but collectively that has a huge effect. To get a better sense of how one group of animals or species can have profound effects on the area that they live, we're going to take a quick look at an example of wolves in Yellowstone Park. Yellowstone Park is out west. It is one of the first areas of land that the United States government preserved. Right, it can never be developed. It's left in a natural state. When European settlers moved out there, we carried a fear of wolves with us. Right? We have a lot of stories and legends about wolves being evil and Little Red Riding Hood, the big bad wolf, that sort of thing, where we've learned from a young age, or culturally, Europeans learned from a young age that wolves were bad. The European culture loves what's called the pastoral. It's like the managed farming, gardening landscape. Right? All the big scary things are gone, and it's just the land that we develop. Because of that, farmers and ranchers out there were afraid that wolves were going to attack and kill them, or attack and kill their livestock. So there were bounties put on wolves. European settlers pretty much killed all of the wolves in the area. That affected the ecosystem of Yellowstone. We can't truly know how it affected the ecosystem because we weren't paying attention to what it was like beforehand, right? So think about it. For thousands of years beforehand, since the end of the Ice Age, the ecosystem had gotten stable. There were indigenous peoples, indigenous tribes that lived in the area, but there was a balance between everything. European settlers show up, we kill all the wolves, and that changed everything. All right. So because we also got rid of the indigenous people, we don't necessarily have the stories and the legends and the cultural history of what life was like before European settlers. And the European settlers that were there didn't care about the ecosystem. They just wanted to turn it into farmland and grassland. We don't have a record of what things were like. But in 1995, we returned wolves to Yellowstone. It was very controversial, and have been able to see the effects of those wolves on the ecosystem since 1995. Let's take a look at a short video explaining what happened.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
One thing they notice is that erosion was minimized by the presence of wolves, which seems weird. How did wolves keep the rivers from eroding? Well, the plants that were able to grow along the riverbanks held those riverbanks together and kept them from eroding away. Okay? Those plants were able to grow larger and stronger because there were no deer eating them. Right? Wolves show up, deer go away, deer don't eat plants, plants stabilize the riverbank, river doesn't erode. This is called a knock-on effect. We create a change, reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone Park. We expect it to have an effect. In this case, we expected that there would be fewer deer, which was actually what we wanted because that many deer can destroy a lot of the plants that live in the area. We see that around here too. There are so many deer in the DC area. You can actually see places where there's like a line of a line like 6 or 7 feet up that the deer are able to eat all of the plant, all of the vegetation up to that level, and that's as high as they can reach, right? Because there's too many of them because there's not enough predators. So we expected the deer populations to fall in Yellowstone, but the knock-on effect of that, or the unexpected effect caused by the expected effect, was that the riverbanks stabilized and the health of the rivers increased for the wildlife. So introduce deer, introduce wolves, wolves drive away deer, deer don't eat the plants, plants stabilize the river, the paths to the rivers change or stabilize. Okay, that's a knock-on effect. This is an important concept. When we do something, it has an effect. That we can anticipate. However, we might not be able to fully anticipate what the effects of the effects are. We do something, it causes something, that cause does something which causes something else. Okay, and that can amplify. We don't exactly know what's going to happen when we make these changes. Because of that, there's a growing awareness that we, humans, should seek to find solutions to our larger problems that align with how nature already works whenever possible. All right. So let's take a look back at floods like New Orleans and think about how the knock-on effect of building levees causes the flooding to worsen. Okay, then we'll start to take a look at some possible solutions that use more natural processes.
This is Eureka, Missouri, a city that floods repeatedly. We're talking catastrophic floods twice in less than 2 years.
Yet more rain and dangerous flooding are affecting millions in parts of the Midwest and South tonight.
Across the Merrimack River, notorious for flooding very quickly.
Towns like Eureka and others, well, they're in for a rough few days.
But just 12 miles downstream is a town called Valley Park. It stayed pretty dry thanks to a levee, a giant artificial embankment that surrounds the city, designed to keep water out. Valley Park got their levee largely because the city was willing and able to pay for it. It kept their own town dry, but here's what flooding looked like in neighboring towns, including Eureka, that didn't have levees.
The Valley Park levee withstood the water.
That levee holding could be part of the problem.
He suspected the same levee that protected Valley Park may have been to blame for devastating flooding in Fenton, Eureka, and Arnold.
Can a levee protect one town while making flooding worse for others, especially towns that can't afford a levee? A fluid mechanics lab, a 13-foot-long model of a river, and some adorable tiny houses will help us find out. People love levees. There's about 100,000 miles of these embankments across the U.S., sometimes concrete, sometimes earthen. For centuries, we've built them between humans and rivers.
Levee workers transport material by hand, by truck, by boat.
We even write songs about them.
I drove my Chevy to the levee, but the levee was dry.
If it keeps on raining, levee's going to break.
When the levee breaks, have no place to stay.
But it turns out, even when levees are effective, they can still be devastating. As far back as 1852, levees came with a very important warning. Charles Ellet Jr., a famed U.S. civil engineer, cautioned that levees confine rivers and cause them to rise higher and flow faster. And relying on levees encourages a false security. But he was largely ignored. Levees became the default for flood control, mostly funded and constructed by local entities. Some riverside communities that could afford it built taller levees for more protection, while less fortunate neighbors dealt with the devastating effects. To show you what we mean, we went to the banks of the Mississippi River, to a fluid mechanics lab where a team of engineers from the University of Minnesota built us this landscape model to test flood scenarios. Overhead, a scanner collects 3D data to measure exactly what's happening. It's a generic model of a river with no levees. That means when the water level increases, it overflows and spreads across the floodplain, often creating important wetland habitat that's home to a variety of species. Putting in levees cuts rivers off from this land, destroying floodplains and wetlands. It allows people to convert these areas into farmland or build houses on them. And while levees protect these communities from flooding, they constrict the river into a narrow channel, making the water flow faster and higher. That creates a bottleneck leading to additional flooding upstream. If all levees are the same height, both sides should be about equally protected from the average flood. And if the river rises so much that the water overtops the levee, then both sides should flood pretty equally. But let's say people on one side of the river lobby for higher levees. Now, instead of both sides flooding, only one floods. The side with the lower levees is at a clear disadvantage. So what can people in flood zones do? We can't just pick up and move major cities. We need levees to protect places like these. There is an alternative. We could build levees farther back so rivers could still expand and create wetlands. These setback levees ease flooding on both sides rather than protecting one city at the expense of another. This approach is common in other parts of the world, like Holland, for example, but not in the US. Here, we tend to build levees right next to rivers. Some communities that can afford to build higher levees do so at the risk of others with little oversight. We do have the Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency tasked with regulating a fraction of all levees. They have to ensure, at least on paper, that federal levees won't dramatically raise local flood levels. But those engineering predictions don't always match reality. For instance, the Army Corps designed Valley Park's levee in the early 90s with data and software from that era. Engineers estimated the levee's impact on neighboring areas would be minimal, but by the time it was completed in 2005, the region had grown significantly. More people had built alongside the river, increasing the risk of flooding, which wasn't considered in the original plan. While we don't know the precise impact of Valley Park's levee on neighboring towns just yet, since the levee was built, the region outside Valley Park has suffered 2 of the worst floods in its history. The Army Corps says they've done nothing wrong and that the levee meets all state and federal laws. But there's a growing body of research that shows levees push flooding onto surrounding communities that have lower levees or no levees at all. Researchers measured water levels around 13 levees in the Midwest and found they all increased flooding, some by over 5 feet. As the climate changes and cities push for higher levees, flooding is only expected to get worse, especially along the Mississippi River, which is almost entirely lined with levees. Some of these embankments have been substantially raised since their completion against federal rules, making flooding worse across the river and upstream. So, yeah, we need some levees, but the system for regulating them is broken. Even though the science overwhelmingly shows that constructing higher levees makes flooding worse in the long term, we keep building them taller, passing our problems upstream.
So, in this video, the presenter mentioned setback levees and allowing wetlands to develop. Setback levees just means that the levees is further inland than the riverbank, and so that gives more room for the river to flood, which allows it to both slow down and be absorbed by the earth. Okay, that allows wetlands to grow, and wetlands are a very important and natural part of a system where the hydrosphere, the water, the geosphere, the earth meet, right? If we change how we create and manage levees to keep our cities and towns from flooding, we can end up creating areas or space that will allow wetlands to return and develop naturally. This can act as a natural flood management system or flood management control. A knock-on effect of that is that there will be more habitat for a larger and more wider diversity of plants and animals. And those wetlands can actually help to filter and get rid of pollutants in the water. Okay, a lot of positive effects from having wetlands. We just have to do things to create, preserve, and manage them. From a flooding perspective, wetlands do 2 primary things. They slow down the speed of a river, okay, meaning that water has less energy to cause erosion, right? Remember, the more energy, the bigger particles that water can move. So if you slow it down, those bigger particles will fall out and it can't move as much, all right? Wetlands also absorb water, which causes it from spreading out into surrounding areas. So the water is coming in, it hits the wetland, and it gets absorbed like a sponge. You pour dry water on a sponge, the sponge absorbs it, the water doesn't spread out. If you have a puddle, another way to think about it, and you put a sponge in it, the sponge will suck up all of that water. Wetlands do something similar. So again, let's take a quick look at that.
Across from MetLife Stadium in the New Jersey Meadowlands, 9 members of the Bergen Grassroots Task Force on Flooding are boarding a pontoon boat on the Hackensack River. Their goal is to understand how marshes and wetlands help protect communities from flooding. Charles Powers is a professor of environmental engineering at Vanderbilt University.
We're a group of really diverse people, including 3 mayors, a couple of the freeholders, bipartisan actually, as well as a lot of citizens who are in trouble. Several of the people who are out here were flooded by Sandy.
Mayor Mauro Raguseo of Little Ferry.
Little Ferry was severely affected by Superstorm Sandy last year. I've been on the Hackensack River before, but this is the first time that I'm actually taking a trip post-Sandy.
New Milford Mayor Ann Sabrizi.
The Hackensack River runs along the western border of my town, top to bottom. I want to find out how the Meadowlands and its attributes affects flooding downstream. We had 4 major floods in year 2011, all caused by the definition of flooding, more rain than the ground can hold.
Boat Captain Hugh Carolla describes the natural resilience of the Meadowlands marshes in the face of severe storms.
These wetlands spread out that storm surge. The wetlands themselves sustained virtually no damage at all. Had we lost these wetlands back in the 70s or 80s, I shudder to think what Sandy would have done.
Flood mitigation tactics include man-made protections such as this 11-foot berm in Secaucus. But the long-term strategy is to continue to restore and strengthen the biodiversity of the marshes themselves. Secaucus Mayor Michael Ganelli.
There's so much value in a wetland. During floods, it becomes a sponge. It becomes an area that takes in water and holds water. One of the things we try to do is get people out here to see the restoration that's taking place, to see the improvements. This is going to be here in perpetuity. This is a 100-year lease, this piece of property.
Jacqueline Gurgis, an adult student at Bergen Community College, sees increased citizen interest in the Meadowlands.
I'm actually very excited and very hopeful for the future because I see a lot of my friends and a lot of the communities are getting involved, and that makes me really happy.
For Mayor Raguseo, protecting the Meadowlands requires research and proactivity.
Now we need to really focus hard. The Meadowlands is a beautiful place to live and to work. It's a natural phenomenon. But when you build on it, there are problems that come with it. We need to address those issues so that people will stay, live, and work here and enjoy what the Meadows has to offer. It's beautiful. That's it. Just to see nature in its glory. That's what the Meadowlands is.
For NJ Arts News, this is Susan Haig.
On an unseasonably cold day in late April, a group of high school students from Washington, D.C. got into Lake Pontchartrain to help save the wetlands that border it. The 10th graders were on a service learning field trip from Washington International School to learn about and help restore Louisiana's wetlands.
We didn't know that the saltwater intruding on the freshwater was such a problem. We didn't know that the coastline was disappearing this dramatically.
The students were working with the LSU Ag Center's Youth Wetlands Program along a section of Lake Pontchartrain in St. Charles Parish. Mindy McCallum Brooks demonstrated how to plant smooth cordgrass, a plant typically found in Louisiana marshes that can tolerate both fresh and salt water and is ideal for rejuvenating eroding wetlands like this one.
So it'll basically build the land by holding on to the dirt and increasing the amount of dirt that kind of stays in that area where they're planted.
The wetland planting was just one part of a trip designed to get the youngsters to understand the importance of Louisiana's coast.
Our estuary system in Louisiana is really the breeding ground for 90% of the seafood that's commercially caught in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's important that people in the rest of the nation know that how important Louisiana is to them for seafood, for energy, for transportation of goods.
These students had classmates working on other service learning projects with Habitat for Humanity and the Second Harvest Food Pantry in New Orleans.
I chose wetland restoration because for me the coast is something that's really important, and I've worked on other service projects outside in the environment before like this.
The students seemed very moved by the work they were doing and forged a connection with Louisiana.
I've never been to a place like this before. It is amazing here. I fell in love with it.
With the LSU Ag Center, this is Toby Blanchard reporting.
The work that these students are doing at Lake Pontchartrain is similar to work that is being done all over the United States to rehabilitate and rebuild our wetlands. Notice in the video just how muddy the ground was. All of that mud and soil can be easily washed away by moving water, by the tides, by the flow of the river, right? The presence of the reeds that they're putting in slows the water down, and that allows the particles to fall out, which builds the land back up, okay? And then the edges of that, new reeds can get built in, and that's how wetlands grow bigger. A while ago we talked about how every year the floods can deposit new soil, which allows deltas to be great places to farm in. Same process. The reeds slow everything down, so the erosion, the soil falls out and creates new land. If we remove the plants, that land, that soil gets eroded away, and there's nothing to help mitigate the flooding from storms and from tide. Okay, so this is a much more natural and long-term solution for how to manage floodwaters compared to building a wall or building a levee. Right? It actually manages it in a natural way that has other positive knock-on effects, whereas a dam or a wall or a levee feels like it works, but it causes other negative effects around us. It's the difference between building just for myself or building for the greater community. Right? And that's why we are moving, or trying to move towards, more solutions that are positive for everybody involved and not just the community that has the most money to build the biggest wall.